Before we begin, the Gamers Advocate would like to remind you that any episode could contain game spoilers, so watch or listen with discretion. And now your hosts, AMKomnenos, Banana, and Legion. Enjoy the show.
As soon as the podcast gets merch, I'm going to be like, what the hell are we doing? How did this succeed at all?
We thoroughly recommend you stop watching.
Yeah.
Please don't comment.
Please don't wear this outside.
The fans we have are pretty loyal, but it keeps putting off people.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's like, if you like this and you present it to somebody else, chances are they won't like it.
Yeah, they'll like you less, too.
You need to gently introduce them to this. We need like a buffer system. Start with these episodes, and then when you're ready for more nonsense, upgrade to this tier.
We can tier list our own podcast.
Yes.
Acceptable introduction.
There's
Never.
a common comment in a lot of YouTube stuff, like when somebody posts a new video, they'll put like, honey, wake up, so-and-so has a new video out. It's but with ours, it would be like, honey, wake up, the Gamers Advocate just put a new, honey? Oh, honey left. She left the house.
Yeah.
I think we're memeable.
Oh, definitely. We're the pick of podcasts. We're the pick of podcasts, and also you have to earn it.
That's on the back. That's on the back. Yes. I'm writing it down.
Yeah.
That's a good one, Banana. Thank you.
I'm pretty good at figuring out what you guys should talk about.
All right. Welcome to yet another episode of the Gamers Advocate podcast. We have today BananaHammockRepublic, AMKomnenos.
You nailed it that time. That's the best one yet.
I think I got it right one time, and then since then I haven't been able to do it again. So, AMKomnenos. I should have just left it alone. Anyway, myself, Legion.
It's another shirt. AMCom, and then
just like a little
progressively smaller text.
It's like you dropped a bag of Scrabble letters.
com.
It's the same way most people pronounce Worcestershire. It's quietly. That's how you pronounce it.
Worcestershire.
Yeah. Wash your sister.
Wash your sister. So today, well, this whole entire month, we are going over spoopy themes, whatever. We might actually sprinkle in some live streams here and there, so check out the channel for sure. Be sure to like, follow, and I always say this at the end, but if we can kind of get that in there early, if you already, I don't know what you like so far in this video, but maybe there's something that you like, go ahead and like and follow us and hit that alert button, and don't hesitate to make comments, because all this month we're going to be going over spoopy things, and we need topics, things that you guys want to see.
Comments are also probably the best way to give us feedback on what you want us to talk about.
Today, though, I think we're going to be going over certain phobias that we have, which lends itself naturally into certain games that are out there. Boy, I know what, you're not too dissuaded, though, from snakes in Resident Evil, right?
I'm terrified by the snakes in Resident Evil. Yes,
Well, I think we've talked about this. You're terrified of real snakes.
I'm terrified of realism in snakes.
The cartoony or oversized snakes that you can handle.
Yeah, so if we take Resident Evil as the direct example, and then Assassin's Creed. So Resident Evil, the gigantic snake that chases you around the attic and around the library, fine. Doesn't look real. It's really awkward to animate, so they can't give it that lifelike feeling. And I know that I'm never going to meet that. However, the little snakes that you can't really see all that well, that are on the landing area or on the pool outside, that sound like real snakes and move like real snakes and hiss like real snakes. That I can't. That gets into me and that gives me chicken skin. Horrible. Assassin's Creed Origins would be exactly the same. The gigantic snake monster that's embodying the god, whatever, fine. The cobras, not fine. played that entire game and just low-lying anxiety. It was horrible, which is also why it became my first ever platinum trophy on the PlayStation. Because through spite, anything is possible. I do have a second phobia as well, by the way, and it's a much lighter one, but it's quite specific, and apparently it is a thing. And the best way I can give you an example of it is to ask you to imagine a pomegranate, the fruit, cut it in half, and looking at all the holes in the pomegranate there.
No, okay.
That cross section.
You are not the first person to tell me they have a similar phobia to that.
There are dozens of us.
Dozens!
It's called like tryptophobia or
It's
something
along
like
those
that.
lines. Yeah, I think there's a TRY in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it would be wasp nests. So the holes in the wasp nest. It would be the cross sections of grapefruits. Grapefruits, cross sections of pomegranates. Sorry, anything like that. The irregular, small circular holes that you see on things just creep me out.
I see a hole. I think it should be filled.
That
If I
that
find you
comment
fucking a
just
pomegranate-
creeped me out.
Turns out I do have another one.
Is there a phobia for that thing Legion just said?
I think just good taste.
Yeah. I have that.
What about you, Banana? Well, you got any specific phobias besides clearly the one I just gave you?
Yeah. I don't know if I have any phobias. There are definitely things that I think probably affect me a little more than the average person. Nothing so overwhelming. I don't like spiders. That's something that I've grown a little more desensitized to playing all these video games. But I've just always had a little bit of an issue with them. And I think that's reflected in the fact, or my distaste for them is reflected in the fact that in like every kind of fantasy game, things based on like D&D, things like the Elder Scrolls, there's always an enemy that is just a spider. And when you look at all of the other enemies in the game, they're fantasy monsters. Like, I'm fighting a dragon. Okay. I'm fighting, a specter or a ghost. Every one of those includes a spider. It's just a spider because they're already nightmare creatures. You don't need to modify them at all. You don't need to tweak them a little bit. You typically end up making them bigger so they seem a little less fragile. But that's really all you do, and they're always still gross. I get it. I get why they're always in fantasy games, why it's always just like, oh yeah, I'm fighting this disgusting monstrosity that's just an amalgamation of corpses and there's limbs everywhere. Also spiders. Just, regular spiders.
I can think of actually two examples of that. So recently I've mentioned to you before that I've been watching a friend on their Final Fantasy journey, playing through 7 and all of its sub-games. And in Cosmo Canyon, there are spider webs that you have to run through. And those spiders with the really thin legs, they're creepy. And for this person who doesn't like spiders very much, that really sort of set them off a bit. And then for myself, I'm not scared of spiders. But honestly, the ones in Resident Evil Remake got me a little bit. Very tarantula looking with the hairiness. Oh, didn't like it. Not a phobia, but really, I could see how if I didn't like it, someone who has a phobia of them, that must have been crushing.
Yeah. And I think that is actually one of those things that I'm loving to see in games more, is those accessibility features to say, like, I have this phobia, can we not bombard me with this type of information?
So, Banana, if you had to, like, say, dispatch a spider and then all of its, like, little baby spiders off of its body were to, like, just go everywhere, that doesn't bother you?
I feel like it would creep me out. It wouldn't be overwhelming to the point where I couldn't handle it, but it would just be like, oh, wow, I really didn't want to experience that. That was awful. And I don't know if there's a phobia for that. Like I'm not afraid of spiders. I'm afraid of being covered in a swarm of spiders. I don't know if that's a phobia so much as just a very reasonable and appropriate fear.
Yeah.
I think But that's really it, isn't it? It's that line between appropriate fear and phobia, and how they become overwhelming. It's like for myself, I think crocodiles are scary, but I wouldn't say I've got a phobia of crocodiles. I've got a very well planned fear of crocodiles because I know that one's going to mess me up if I meet it.
I'm alive! Don't start what you can't finish! Quit hitting yourself! Quit hitting yourself! Quit hitting yourself! Oh, water tastes good, yes! Club!
You know, I can watch them on TV, that's fine. I can hear about them, that's fine. I could even probably be within sort of 100 feet of one. But I have enough of a fear that I'm not getting within 10 or 20 or whatever it might be. And I think that's that fine line, isn't it, between phobias and fear, is for me the snake thing. It's video game snakes that scare me. TV snakes scare me. TV snakes have me checking around my feet just in case I didn't see the python in the apartment earlier.
Yeah. I don't really think I have one probably that would fit itself into a horror game. But things like creatures and stuff like that, no, there's something wrong with the brain in here as far as my self-preservation on that stuff. I'm good. A fear of tight spaces. I've done them. I do fine, but I don't look forward to them. I don't encourage myself to go caving, for instance. You know, that part of my brain that is self-preservation does react to that. When I see other people do it, I'm like, there's no need for that. You don't need to do that, you know.
I think that's very much kind of that separating line that we were talking about. It's a very appropriate, reasonable fear. And I will definitely say I've gone through OSHA maritime training as part of work. And part of that is an enclosed spaces training where they talk about atmospheric conditions, meaning like the gas content within those enclosed spaces and how quickly that can change. And that is now a very informed, reasonable fear. It's not a phobia, but it's a very, very much I'm not going to do that unless I have a very, very good reason to.
That's what I am as well with caving. I can watch caving YouTube videos and caving disaster videos. That interest me. No problem whatsoever. But I think it's one of the only sports where I would say, well, yeah, caving's a sport, isn't it? It's one of the only sports that I would say to myself, I have no interest in doing this. I really don't want to. So I think it would be that measured fear rather than a phobia.
Yeah, and I have a certain level of respect for not the sport necessarily of it, but there have been some archaeological discoveries that have occurred because the scientists themselves said, hey, you know, there's this cavern that's underneath, and 50,000 years ago, this was not underwater. Maybe there's, and sure enough, they have found human activity in some of those caves that should have been not accessible. Further proof of environmental change and how long humans and society have been around, you know, so without those people. I have no
idea why, but I thought you were going to say further proof of alien involvement.
Yeah. Well, clearly they were hiding from the aliens. That's how they got there. So
I had one of those a few moments ago as well when Legion said he was afraid of tight spaces. There was this brief pause and I thought, he's afraid of tights? Like leggings?
Yeah.
Okay.
I hate spandex.
No pants is the best pants. Yeah.
Agreed.
No argument here.
Just keep these webcams where they are, boys.
It's another one of the Gamers Advocate bold stances. No pants, best pants.
I can add to when you were saying about the archaeological discoveries and so forth that you might find in caving. Honestly, I take much more joy in someone diving down into, like a 1,000-foot cave, going through all these cracks and crevices they shouldn't be able to get through, and they're squeezing and they're pushing all the air out of their lungs so they can crawl their way along. I take much more pleasure in them doing that and finding nothing at the end. I like that idea of just humans doing things because they can. Not that there has to be a result. It's just, no, because I can. Because I want to. Say the old idea of George Mallory climbing Mount Everest, and someone says to him, "What's the reason for climbing Mount Everest?" And he replies, "Because it's there." And I love that response. It's the most perfectly human thing.
But for me personally, I climb 5 Everest before I do one cave.
Agreed.
Like, because there's caving and then there's dive caving. That's a different story. Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. There you go. But so that's kind of, like I said, it's kind of a weird phobia, but no, I don't really have.
I think that that is one of the very amusing elements of human beings. That point you mentioned with climbing Mount Everest just because it's there. I always think of those things where we look back and, like, anthropologists and archaeologists will look back and view, you know, the evidence that we have of ancient societies and try to extrapolate from there what things meant to them. And I just imagine 1 or 2 guys who were just like, let's just go do something that makes no sense because we can. And then thousands of years later, people looking back and being like, this must have had some tremendous significance to these people. I love that idea.
That is the problem, especially with anything pre-Roman, for example, in the British Isles. The archaeological record is so porous. There's so little that you do have to really just add on to it. Your own ideas, your own prejudices. And we do spend a lot of time correcting that almost, and realizing that some things, especially individual finds, may not have that significance we thought they did. It's one of those interesting developments you see in late 20th century and certainly 21st century historiography, is that idea of reevaluating our historical record and the way that we look at these.
Yeah. Like JFK said, you know, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because they are hard. Something like that.
That's pretty much it.
I was going to say, not quite that. But yeah.
That's the gist.
You got the spirit. Yeah.
The spirit, which is a Spoopy Month spirit. So,
yeah. We're tying it back.
So, is there a game that you would say that really, because to me, maybe, I mean, I'd like to say a game like Soma, but I don't think either of you have played Soma.
But I know of it, but I've never played it.
PT definitely is in that vein. So,
but I think there's an interesting thing now we're going to find with horror games and phobias is when we're finding games that, for example, trigger our worst phobias, they're probably not going to be horror games. Horror games, you know what you're going into when you get into them. And they're not targeting, generally, people who happen to be afraid of snakes, people who happen to be afraid of spiders. They're in this much broader sense of horror. It's dark spaces, it's confined environments, and there are people with those phobias, of course, and it's going to hit them a bit harder. But they're not targeting the claustrophobic audience. They're just trying to target isolation.
Right.
It's very broad ideas. So I wonder if, as we search for examples of games that hit on our phobias, if we actually won't be talking directly about horror games so much. Like when I mentioned earlier, probably the worst example for my snake phobia was Assassin's Creed Origins, which is incredibly unhorror.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. We're approaching that difference between phobia and rational fear. And most horror games will approach rational fear. They won't target phobias because they're supposed to be universally scary. And phobias are those exceptions. Those are the people in a smaller category who have a much more extreme reaction to these things. Whereas in horror games, you're looking for the commonalities, the people who have a general visceral reaction universally. So I will say that spiders probably play a role in both of those things because there's a very reasonable instinctual disposition against spiders in human beings, not at that phobia level. There's that initial, like, I don't like that. It's very foreign. It's not familiar. It's creepy in the way that it moves. We are biologically dissuaded from seeing them as familiar and understandable. We can, because we're, intelligent, we can overcome that. But overwhelmingly, horror is looking for those things, that natural, common, visceral response to say that I don't want to be anywhere near that. That's not what phobias represent. Phobias represent a more targeted, and if you're building your horror game to target people with a phobia, you're a bad person.
and a very, very bad marketer, because you've now got a big group that's not going to buy it. You've
Yes.
got a huge group are going to be far too scared to buy it, and a huge group who won't care.
Yeah,
So
you'll have a group that doesn't care and a group that actively doesn't want to, and that group that doesn't want your product is the target audience.
So what are then, if I can sort of approach it from this way, what are those global things that you could use then? Because weirdly, there are very common phobias. Spiders is a very common one. Snakes is a very common one. You don't find that many snakes in games, thankfully. And I wonder how much of that is how awkward they are. The animation seems to be difficult to make them convincing. Even in Assassin's Creed, they didn't move. They were just always on the spot. They had no moving animation. They could just strike, and that was it, which was enough. But
I think that's probably a big part of it. I think animating their movement for both spiders and snakes, you're doing a lot of things. First of all, there's a lot moving. Snake movement is predicated on their entire body shifting.
My feet for snakes.
Yeah. And spiders, there's a lot moving because there's 8 legs and the body is supported by those in a very kind of unique way. So nobody's doing mocap on these animals. So trying to put animation to these things that are kind of universally creepy and scary is really difficult. And that might be the reason why they're not so universally implemented.
Yeah, I would be willing to go along with that. Just the pure difficulty of it, the awkwardness. Which is why I really hope someone doesn't come up with a convincing model for the Unreal Store that we're going to suddenly find in every
If
game.
I see a mocap suit for a snake out there, you're fired.
Well, this might be then why, and I think it's a common theme in horror generally, and it's going to be in video games as well. 2 things which I think come up and they're linked is sickness.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have very pallid people, extremely pale, and almost like you can see the sort of the veins with the skin. It's like there's a very human reaction to that. Okay, something is sick. I probably shouldn't get too close. And then you have at the same time something we mentioned in one of the earlier podcasts, which is dolls. Those old toys,
Yes.
the porcelain effect, where it looks human, but it's not quite human. Something's off, that uncanny nature, and they often have that very glassy appearance as well.
I'm going to go ahead and throw clowns into that same category. Because I think that is weirdly universally, people don't like clowns. I don't know why they exist. Because they're supposed to be children's entertainment, but it seems like we all agree that they're horrifying. So, like, why are we pushing that on children? But it is for all the same reasons. All the same reasons as dolls.
They don't bother me. They're fine.
I wouldn't say that I have a phobia of them, but I don't know anyone that genuinely enjoys clowns.
Yeah, this is it. Like, the best reaction you get is ambivalence.
Yeah.
And the worst you get is abject terror.
It's funny because when I went to the doctor's office, my great aunt was a nurse, and the clinic where I went to, she was a nurse at, and the doctor always had pictures of clowns in all the rooms. And I just, like, to me, it was like second. I totally get it. I come from that old generation where, like, the clowns served that vintage look and purpose, and it wasn't really construed in a, like, oh, it's clowns are, they don't make sense. They're displaced from society and reality, and so therefore they're a little spooky. I don't get that, but that's because I'm just in a different time period. But I get what you're saying.
I think it's what Com was highlighting with his discussion of dolls is that it's not that they're very foreign, it's that they're just different enough.
Right.
It's that they're very, very close to human, but not quite.
Yeah.
And clowns do that.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a few tech companies that have made Android type models, both in reality and also and software. But they found out that there's a point where, like, you want to make them actually not a human enough, because if you make them too human, suddenly there's a visceral response from people that they just can't stand it. So there's actually the other side of it. It's like you don't want them to be actually right on the nose human, because apparently there is that point, there's that trigger point where people are just cannot trust it.
I think you see that with video gaming. We don't want to get to a point where things are too realistic. We always want that little buffer, that little safety window. There are some exceptions. I think sports games in particular, for them, they'll always strive for realism. But generally, we want to have that little safety net and look at games coming out, big titles. Dragon Age Veilguard coming out in the next few months. Nothing looks real. It's beautiful, but it's all got that video game sheen to it. And I think we'll see a lot of that in the future. We're not going to see, after a certain point that I think we've pretty much reached, we're not going to see more striving for genuine realism. We might want to have the capability to do it, but I think we will artistically choose not to.
I think we're kind of talking about this in a way that I understand, and potentially I may be misunderstanding the reality of the situation, but I think this is what people mean when they talk about Uncanny Valley.
Yeah.
It's this, and it's called Uncanny Valley, and I could be wrong about this, but it's the way that it makes sense to me is because if you imagine a graph of people's response to a representation of a human being as opposed to an axis of realism, you will see that people have a tendency to appreciate increased realism up to a point. And then there's that weird point where it's a little too real, but not quite there. And when you go past that, they start to appreciate it again because it's actually real. And Uncanny Valley is that spot where it's not quite real enough, but it's also too real. And that is that spot where you don't want to be. It's creepy.
Yeah, exactly the right words. Creepy. It's unsettling just across the board. You often find that they include dead people in the Uncanny Valley because everything about you is human except that life.
Yeah.
And that would be that real drop, like that real base of the valley is someone who's dead or someone who's close to death. Which is just, if you've ever been around someone in that situation, it's genuinely unsettling. No matter how well you know this person.
And I think that's exactly it. Close to death falls into that category as well. So that element you were talking about, people who are very pallid, people who are emaciated, people who are very, very ill, look so separate from humans, but also they're not at all. They're very human. It's that unsettling combination of those two things where it's like, that's not close to me, but I could definitely be that if something goes wrong.
Yeah, and also that realization that you probably will be at some point. And that will really just get into your soul. It puts its claws in.
Yeah, on a parallel type note, I think some of the indie developers are doing something pretty unique with their environments. So you take a universal concern, being stranded on the road, for instance. You go into the nearest location and there's some shady people there, maybe it's late at night, whatever, you're lost. All these plethora of different issues that come along to make the scene horrific. Maybe not a horror, but it's horrific, right? So when you go to those scenes, yeah, it's pretty real to you because you can see yourself in that environment and not really have everything available to you. Maybe you've got no signal on your phone. Maybe your phone died. Maybe you lost your phone. Who knows? Maybe there's just no way to communicate except through the person that's immediately in front of you, and he's pretty shady to begin with. But here's the thing. You go and check the vending machine and it's like the craziest names for the drinks, right? So it kind of brings you back in a little bit. So what they're doing is they're taking that same thing, is that it's not a one-to-one where everything is immediately real to you, but they also make it real enough to where you can see yourself in here, but gives you that little bit of buffer. So that way you're kind of in and out of that scene to kind of give you some relief, because if it's always tension, then there is no tension. You get used to that.
Yeah, I think Com mentioned this in a previous episode, that element of levity in a horror scene, that brief relief to say that, like, not everything is trying to kill you or something along those lines. Like, not everything is furthering that terrified emotion that you're experiencing. Some of these things are just playful. Some of these things are truly innocent, and you can clearly recognize them when they're there. It's all of this other stuff that's ambiguous or very clearly sinister that you have to worry about, but you have that kind of anchor in something familiar or something playful that you can kind of fall back on to say that, like, all right, I have to go deal with whatever nonsense is going on around me, but like in the meantime, I'll enjoy this world's version of Nuka-Cola, where it's, you know, we're weirdly building a brand off an atrocity. It's somewhat playful somehow.
I think, yeah, because I'm trying to think of examples of games that don't give you that relief and that release. And the only one I can think of is PT. And I think it works because it's only an hour long or an hour and a half. So you can ramp up that tension for an hour and a half and you can pretty much permanently be there. It's a long time and you'll probably feel by the end you're at your limit. But you can do it. But yeah, as soon as things get a bit longer, it's the same experience of just life, and you need some bad days so that you know what the good days are. If everything is just always the same, if it's always good, nothing is good. If everything's always bad, nothing's bad. It's just always the same. And horror needs to give you that same life cycle. You need those peaks and valleys, those ups and downs. And I think it's a really cute example, the idea of, just going and looking at the products in the vending machines that are just silly names, whatever it might be. Because it just gives you a moment. You can take as long as you need, get that heart rate down before we get back in and, like Banana said, find the truly sinister stuff.
I think it's funny that in your little scenario, your horror scenario that you conjured up, Legion, you also gave kind of almost accidentally some answers to Com's question of, you know, what is it that horror studios are trying to play on? What is those universal concerns? And one of them, well, obviously, we all kind of imagine that scenario at night. Darkness adds to that. But the idea of like your car breaking down and you are now forced to deal with your immediate surroundings as opposed to continue escaping from that. That feeling of being trapped to some degree, it's a universally terrifying experience. That ambiguity of the people you're interacting with, not knowing their intentions, not knowing the type of person that they are, and finding that you need to rely on them in that situation, that ambiguity, that unknown element of the potential evil that exists in every person, that is another universally scary concept, to say that I need to rely on a complete stranger that I know nothing about, but I do know that we as a species are capable of horrible things. And even though the odds are against it, this person might be one of those outliers who is that monster. And I think those are elements that you'll find in a lot of horror games, those things that play off the darkness, the unknown, things that you know there's something beyond what you can see immediately, but you don't know what it is. That's terrifying. The fact that you are in a position where you have to deal with this, that feeling of helplessness to escape, that feeling of being trapped, that's universal. And I think you'll see a lot of those in horror games.
And what's funny is that you can even, as some of these indie titles would do, they'll present the facts, but they sound ridiculous. And but because you don't know the person, you don't know how to. Yeah,
that's real life.
yeah. So like you go up to the gas station attendant who, you know, like you said, maybe he's a good guy, maybe he's not. Who knows? But he's like, you know what? You need to be careful out there. That chupacabra's been taking some folks. And you're like, what? So
I'm sorry, the chupacabra?
Yeah, exactly. So like in real life, we'd be like, okay, all right, I know who I'm dealing with here. But in a horror game, you are playing a horror game. Maybe the chupacabra's real. So there's like there's some games that have done that they'll actually take away the illusion of deception, and it actually works.
Well, I think there's that other element of realism there to say that, like, we live in a world where people believe in a chupacabra, people believe in Mothman, people believe in the New Jersey Devil, or whatever it is, whatever monstrosity it is that exists in their local environment. They have legends about it, and those legends always stem from a very real reaction to unknown or to insufficient information. To say that, like, I saw something wandering through the woods, this enormous hulking figure, and I didn't know what it was, so I tried to process what I did know, and it still didn't fit all of the information that I had, so it must be this monster. I think the fact that people will believe in some of those monsters still suggests that whatever they encountered, probably not a chupacabra, but whatever it was, still exists and is terrifying. Yeah, I'm just leaving myself it out there. Probably not a chupacabra, but it might be.
But we know Bigfoot's real. He's just not very photogenic. So
one of Bigfoot's most identifying characteristic is that he's always out of focus.
Yeah. It's because he's phasing in and out of reality. He's not part of this realm. I mean,
that's an evolutionary
on,
trait. That's not an issue with your camera.
Yeah.
I'd like to imagine that somewhere way back there, both Bigfoot and John Cena share a common ancestor.
I love that. Just imagine somebody snagging a picture of this big shadow in the woods and it's going like this.
That would be great. That would be great. Yeah.
There's more merch for the store.
Yeah.
Bigfoot waving his hand in front of his face.
Or how about a WWE crossover where, you know, it's in the ring.
The John Cena Bigfoot tag team.
Bigfoot walks. We could. Where's the show? I don't see nobody out here in the ring.
There's no reason wrestling couldn't do this. We've had Mantor before. We've had the Yeti. It's a big world. There's room for a Bigfoot in there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I have not met Bigfoot, but I have encountered their cousin Big Butt.
Thank you for making that disclaimer, by the way. I haven't met Bigfoot. Oh,
Yeah.
I assumed you had.
I mean, I have done a lot of outback hiking, so in case anybody was curious, I have not personally.
There is a tie back there, weirdly enough. This idea of these kind of universal fears and how they manifest in these kind of legendary creatures. So you'll see things like, you know, the New Jersey Devil is a very popular one, relatively close to me, and it's a lot of the same stuff, and people create their own local legends about these insufficient stories where you just don't have all of the information. So they fill in the gaps with a playful kind of version of reality where this monster exists, and they encourage that kind of engagement in storytelling. And some people will start to believe the story a little too much, and then time will pass and it becomes almost kind of a historical story, an account of things that actually happened, and that ambiguity starts to work its way in. And I think that plays into a lot of our fears, and one of those is the inability to recognize what is and is not real. I think that's something you'll see very, very commonly in Lovecraftian horror. Things that play off the idea of madness, of disconnecting from reality to the point where you have to doubt everything. You have to doubt all of your senses because they could be lying to you.
Fallout 76, isn't that based on Pennsylvania? Because
West Virginia, I think.
West Virginia, that's right. So there's a lot
basically
of
the same thing.
Yeah, it's the thing. But
As someone who's been to both, you're probably right.
well, there's a lot of I think
I am somebody who's been to both, and I am
someone
right.
else who's been to both.
Yes.
Yeah, I think they have taken in a lot of those myths and legends and stuff from that area and incorporated into the game. Although not necessarily for the horror, but it is a nice little change of pace, because it can't just be all, you know, nuclear zombie stuff, you know?
Right.
Well, that's a wink and a nod to folklore. It's these stories that if you have any familiarity with the region, you probably know them. So it's just, to use a really lame word, it's just neat to see it in a video game. And like you said, the thing with a setting like Fallout is it could be very, very dark. And it's not. It's the whole point of Fallout is it really isn't. It's one of the most frivolous and facetious games you will ever find. And it's really where its charms come from. So if anything is going to take in is it the Mothman in West Virginia?
Mm-hmm.
If any game is going to, it's going to be that. And I'm sure Fallout Australia will have the drop bears, for example.
I'm not sure if Mothman is Virginia or West Virginia, but I think it's that region.
Okay.
Southern
I'm also not sure if
Appalachia.
the game is in West Virginia.
Yeah. I think we're all close enough.
It's over there.
Eastern U.S., roughly the middle of the country, north to south.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah. And watch,
My mouth
somebody's gonna
fucking shut.
somebody's gonna correct us saying it is specifically southeastern Ohio. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of ways your environment can play into those kind of natural fear responses. And I think that's why we see a lot of horror games in forest settings, is forests provide cover. There is that wall of trees, and it's not uniform. It's not very clearly a wall. There's not a physical barrier that makes you feel safe. There's just a visual barrier that makes you feel like you're not seeing everything. And environment is a huge part of the way you feel about your surroundings, like the way you process information.
They're also full of sound. Very, very
Yes.
small sounds. Animals running around, the wind through the leaves. Any leaf falling has that tiny little crispiness to it. And it's also very muffling if the leaves have fallen. So you have this very oppressive soundscape where it's very hard to actually distinguish anything. Combine that with your visual obstructions, and it's one of the most disorienting environments you can be in.
I think the other part of forests adding to that inherent fear is they're alive. There's life everywhere, and not all of that life is innocuous. Not everything that's in that forest is something you as an individual can handle or even might be aware of. I'd say, like, I've gone camping in areas and thought, I wonder how many bears live in this area. I don't know how far we are from, like, their preferred habitat. I don't want to be in their preferred habitat.
I saw a bear when I was in the USA from inside a cabin. Saw it, and me and the person I was with, we just didn't leave for quite a while.
Probably a
left
good
a good
call.
hour and a half. Just it didn't feel worth it.
Yeah, last time I went to Yellowstone, there was a trail that I was thinking about camping at, but I was told I couldn't because, and it's the Mary Jane Trail in Yellowstone. You can look it up, but it's from one highway to another highway, and I thought, well, I'll just camp somewhere in there. And they said, no, you're not allowed. There's too many bears in that area. Oh, okay. So we hiked it just from one end to the other. What made that problematic is that I had to make sure that somebody picked us up at the other side. But yeah, I mean, I've hiked all around bears before. Never worried about them. Again, there's something wrong with this. There's a certain part of my brain that doesn't worry about that stuff.
I think bears are one that you can kind of rationalize your way around, because I think there's enough information for most of us that we understand that, like, if we take certain precautions, we can avoid them. I feel like the more you know about a situation, the less likely you are to be terrified of it. And so having a little bit of understanding of how, bears respond to humans makes it a little more easy to exist near them.
As long as I'm not a brown bear. Brown bears are
That's the-
just, they don't care. They will gobble you up. Yeah.
What about polar bears?
Yeah.
But this is the
That's
thing
why
as
we
well.
choose not to live near them.
Speak for yourself. That's the beautiful thing, though, in life generally, isn't it? Is fear just comes from things that you don't know. If you think of, for example, have you ever... Yeah, isn't it a nice example? So, in France, where I live, every letter that you might ever get from the government is sent in the same envelope. And it's got the little flag in the corner, and it's got the Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, so it's got the French sort of slogan. And every time you get one of those letters in your letterbox, there's that moment of, oh shit, what have I done? And then you open it and it's, a tax is being revised. Or you open it and it's just an administrative thing that you forgot about. But that moment of not knowing what's in it, whilst having that big just association with, in this case, the state, is terrifying. And in this case, bears sound scary as hell. And then, like you say, you learn a bit more, you understand, or you try to understand how they react to humans, what precautions you can take, and it becomes a little easier. And over time, you end up like Legion in this complete Zen state around bears.
I am their friend.
I think, yeah, that
Be it.
in the example of that that letter you get. It's not so much the missing information as much as it is you have just enough information to know this could be very bad, and the exact information you need to know to determine how bad it is the stuff you don't have. You know enough to think like, oh, I'm getting deported or something along those lines. Or it could just be like, this administrator has chosen to step down and will be replaced, and you're in their district or whatever, so it may have some impact on you. Like, oh God, do I not care? But when I thought I was being deported, I cared very, very much.
Yeah. We're reinitiating the Guillotine Act, and you're first on the list.
I wouldn't care. I don't have enough money for anybody to want that for me.
So one other environment that really has never, well, I can't say never, but, you know, I come from a medical.
Say never. Just say never.
Well, I come from a medical background too. So, but there's a lot of horror games and spooky games that love to incorporate the mental institution or something like that. So they oversell it basically. So, but there is a lot of horror elements there, because even if you are in a situation like that, you get this sterile feeling. Either nobody cares about you or they dismiss you. Two immediate horror elements right there. You're powerless to everything. Or they're also trying to create a hospital element that's not sanitary. It's very unsafe. And maybe there's a lot of mental issues going on with both you and or other player or NPCs or whatever that are out to get you. So maybe you're in a facility like that. Maybe there's nothing necessarily going on with you, but you can't control everybody else around. So it's this lack of control in a hospital environment that seems to be replayed a lot in some of those games.
Yeah, I think the hospital environment plays most, in my mind, off of that self-doubt element. Because if you play a video game or you watch a movie from the point of view of somebody in a mental hospital, and they start kind of discovering what feels like a conspiracy around them, the idea that like the administration isn't doing what they're supposed to, they're dismissing very real concerns, and they're doing kind of their own nefarious, sinister thing in the background, it feels very concerning. And then at the end it could just be like, oh no, you're playing as somebody who has delusional paranoia. Like, this is just what it is to exist as that person. That's terrifying to not be able to differentiate between those two scenarios. I think that is, and that's that element of madness that like kind of generally pervades in horror, to say that like, is this all in my head, or am I the only sane one? And that's a terrifying question.
Yeah. Yeah, so that game I had mentioned before in a couple podcasts ago about the Yume Nikki, I think, that you're set in a mental institution, and the people that are helping you are supposedly may or may not actually be helping you, and all you're doing is walking around, and you uncover a lot of things, and it's definitely one that dives into that world, and yet graphically speaking, it's a pixel game. You get the feeling without it being that, so it's just the environment alone that can make you gravitate toward the horror aspects of it. But yeah, and it's a free game, so go play it.
for whatever reason, triggered a memory for me, which highlighted another potential universal fear. And I think you'll see it a lot in zombie games. It's that fear of an adversary that you know that is never relenting. It's the idea that like zombies might be slow, they might be stupid, but their whole existence is to eat you or whatever it is that they are in that world. And they're already dead. So like you can't rely on them just getting fatigued and giving up. They're just going to pursue you forever. That idea of a never-ending chase is terrifying. And like there are some games where the game itself is absolutely nonsense. Nothing about it is terrifying. It's very immediately presented to you as this is a joke. But there's a foe in that game that has this feature, this never-ending, relentless pursuit of you. And the game I'm thinking of right now, it's called Chicken in the Darkness. It is it's barely a game. It's hilarious in its presentation. It feels like it should be a comedy game from like the premise, but it's a horror game. And the idea is, I believe it's Korean. But you are a student in what I assume is a Korean school. You're in a dormitory, and I guess somebody ordered fried chicken, and you drew the short straw and have to go retrieve it from the front door and then return to your room. And then they introduced this horror element of you can't get back to your room right away for some reason, and you need to kind of like gather supplies to navigate the school and attached dorm and get back to your room. And then you encounter this weird enemy that I think is just a floating head that just pursues you relentlessly, and it can phase through walls and floors. So you have to use the fact that you can navigate floors and go up and down and open doors to navigate the building. But this enemy that moves probably slower than you do throughout the entirety doesn't need to worry about those obstacles. They're just always chasing you and phasing through them to the point that like there's a weirdly genuine fear. Like, I don't want to be caught. I know it's kind of a like hilariously not scary game, but just the idea of being caught as a fear, it's there. There's some element of horror, even though the game itself feels like it shouldn't be scary at all.
Yeah. It's interesting because similar to another chicken game, it's a big chicken. It's called Chicken Feet, and it chases you around. That's from 2022. It was a lot of people played it when that first came out because it's so goofy. But yeah, you get chased by this large chicken, and yeah, you can avoid it by getting in certain crevices because it's so big it can't get there. But yeah, if you get enough big enough chicken, it'll eat you.
Yeah, I'm going to change the subject.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like we've lost Com, and he wants us to get back onto genuine horror games and not this nonsense that we've brought up.
Well, I was going to return to the zombie point that you made a few minutes ago, prior to that detour.
I think you mean the chicken in the darkness point.
I'm going to focus on that bit that I was focused on. So the zombie that always is chasing you, always pursuing you, and ultimately you can outrun it, but you can't outlast it. You see it in horror movies. So Michael Myers is the prime example of this. Jason as well. They're never going to run after you, but they will get to you at some point, one way or the other. And it doesn't really matter what you do in between. And I do wonder, and this is a bit tenuous, but I do wonder to what point, when we think of enemies like that, at what point we're actually just afraid of ourselves. Because if you think of humans in the animal kingdom, essentially us on a primal level, we can't outrun a deer. We actually can't outmuscle many animals that's going to be of an appropriate size compared to us. But we can sweat. We're very good at that. So if you put us in a foot race against pretty much any animal in the world over distance, we're going to win. At some point, we have that Michael Myers quality, where if you are a deer, essentially being chased by a primitive human, you're going to outrun him until your heart stops. And you're going to still see him over the distance, walking or lightly jogging after you, sweating off the heat that's building up within him, before he then kills exhausted you. So I wonder at what point we are essentially making horror villains that are ourselves. They're just humans, and we're putting ourselves in the position of these animals that we would once have been hunting on foot. They say it's tenuous, but I do wonder to what extent that's true.
The killer advocate. Come.
Yeah, I feel like there's always an element of familiarity to horror, to say that it has to be relatable for you to genuinely have a fear of it. And in a lot of cases, it's the consequence that's familiar. The idea of pain or death being the reward, maybe the harbinger of those things isn't familiar, but you can still be afraid of that because you know what it comes from. But I think in those examples where you have that like never-ending pursuer, you feel like you can outrun it, but you'll never be able to relax. You'll never be able to truly rest. You'll never be able to just enjoy yourself because there's always that looming threat. And like the idea of a life without even the tiniest bit of luxury, the tiniest bit of just, I'm going to take a moment and enjoy this, that's terrifying.
It reminds me of the horribly slow murderer with the extremely inefficient weapon. If anyone remembers that meme from 15 years ago.
I guess it would also be a meme at this point, but there was a pretty kind of like, would you rather question? It was very popular that I remember seeing, and one of the options was like, you will always be chased by a snail, and if the snail touches you, it kills you. And that was the negative consequence to the benefit you got from this would you rather question. I just remember thinking like, it sounds stupid, it sounds laughable, but the idea of this permanent threat that's always slowly, very slowly advancing towards you, I don't like it.
You'd have to sort of figure out how quick it could move and never be more than like 1 day away from it, so you could keep that perspective. Because if you met it in New York, this starts in New York, and you get on the first flight to Australia, well, maybe it's on its way here slowly via the seabed, because I'm assuming it's a magical snail.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it hitched a ride on that plane. Maybe it hitched a ride on the delivery truck. Maybe you'd have no sense. So yeah, it sounds goofy, but as soon as you give it the slightest bit of thought as to how overdriven your brain would become,
absolutely,
it's horrible.
Yeah, the overanalyzing this thing is where the fear really sets in.
Kind of what I've said before with some Lovecraft, Poe, all those other horror. The true enemy is what's in your head and how you're perceiving it.
I think it's snails.
It's just a snail. Okay.
Yeah, were you not listening?
Yeah.
I think
Snails with knives.
Snakes, spiders. Y'all just don't like S's. So
yeah.
So whereas before we were talking about examples where we can understand where they're coming from, it's the unknowable in just in a different form, in an actual physical form.
I think this is where you pull around back to what Banana was saying about how the consequences can be real. So if you imagine Alien, for example, being on board, is it the Sevastopol in Alien, or is that the game?
No. The game Sevastopol.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you imagine being stuck on board the Sevastopol and you're being pursued by this alien. The very real consequence of that alien catching you is death. Yeah. So you can already identify with that. And I think the fear is something where it almost doesn't matter that it's an alien. That could just be a guy with a knife. That could be a snake. It could be I didn't like that thought. It could be anything you like, as long as that simple real basis is there, where that consequence is real.
It's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I think you're also right. The foreign element of it makes it scary as well, and I think it really plays into the fact that fear is really, like what you said, it's all about what's going on in your head. So we know the familiar elements are pain and death. Those are things we already understand, and we know we're going to encounter those with these monsters. The things that we don't know scare us just as much because they could be far worse than our imagination. And the things that we know that separate this thing from us also scare us. Because we think of, if I'm being pursued by a person and I have some tool at my disposal, and like in a brief altercation I slash out with like a knife or something and break the skin, and now my antagonist is bleeding, they're weakened. That's good news for me. With Alien, if I break the skin, they're bleeding, and now they have a new weapon at their disposal because that blood is acid to me. It will burn through me and cause so many more problems. That foreign element makes them even more scary because now I don't even know what I can do to fight back. Because the things that I would use against somebody I knew, a human being, are bad ideas. They are somehow making this enemy even more capable of killing me. Now they're capable of killing me by just bleeding above me. That's not a predatory skill. Nobody's training these animals to elevate themselves above me and then bleed. That's nonsense. But the fact that they are so not human that I now have nothing at my disposal to fight back because I just don't know anything about them. I don't know what their weaknesses are. That's terrifying as well. So it's all the stuff that's going on in your head. It's all the like, well, what do I know? Everything I know is terrifying. What don't I know? Equally terrifying.
Yeah, in film with Alien, I just as an example, you brought it up, but even the scientists that think that they know the alien well enough that they have it contained, they're studying it, they're doing all this other stuff, they haven't escaped, they're going to do what they want to do because they can manipulate the situation. So what do these aliens do? They gang up 2 against 1 so that way his blood can go through the bottom of the floor and then they all escape. And that's my point. You can't rationalize what you can't ever understand. And so again, there's the familiar that makes it just enough to where it's palpable so we know that's scary and there's a horror there. And then there's the other side of it, the unknowable, and there's no way we can ever know everything about it. That makes that also equally horrible. And you would think that would be like out of touch. Like, well, if we can't know it, can't be that scary. But yet it exists.
I think that that's where ultimately all of the horror plays out. Because we've talked about other elements of horror previously, and a lot of things that like were presented with a horrifying monster. And once you kind of have a moment to take a breath and think about it, you can overcome a lot of that stuff. So we've talked about the way horror is presented in things like Dark Souls games, or maybe Dead Space is more appropriate. But the idea of this fighting against a monstrosity, something that is just so awkward looking, so gross, or just terrifying, something that looks incredibly capable of doing harm to you. Those are all things that you can accept, things that you can then adapt to. What really makes them scary is what you can think of. So, yeah, this thing looks horrifying. This thing looks disgusting. All right, I have to fight it anyway. Then you start to wonder, like, okay, why does it look disgusting? What is the reason for all of these things that make it capable of being destructive? Or what tools does it have at its disposal to counter whatever it is I'm going to try? Does it have some kind of regenerative capability? Do I have that kind of terror that should be setting in where everything I think will harm this creature doesn't actually work? It's immune to most of the things that I would think of. So it's all kind of what's going on in your head. It's all playing back and forth between the information that you do have and the information that you don't.
And that's why for me, I don't consider this a very much of a horror game for me, Subnautica, but it seems to check all those boxes. You have the compartmentalization. issue, you have the underwater issue, you have the unknown, you have the anxiety of having to, progress, otherwise you'll die. I mean, right at the very beginning, you have to acquire water somehow, and you're surrounded by seawater, so how are you going to get water? Things like that are just like very, very simple things. And they're stresses. And then you have the other elements like the animals that are unknown to you.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of horror elements there that it seems like a lot of that is all in once, and they're foreign. They're not foreign. They're alien.
Yeah, I think Subnautica hits a lot of the elements we talked about when we were discussing the environment of the forest. There's that wall for visibility that doesn't actually offer protection. Light doesn't work as well in water, so you can't see as far. There's a lot of ambient life. It's an ecosystem, and you don't know exactly what is beyond that visible limit. So there's a lot of potential for something horrible to be out there. And I will say it's probably less so of the sound element that we saw, but there's probably some sounds going on. There's probably sounds related to the suit you're wearing or whatever housing you're in that allows you to exist in that environment, that then overrides sounds that might be very important to you in the environment. So you hear, something bubbling as air is being processed by this suit, and it covers up a sound that you should be aware of that indicates you're in danger. There's a lot of commonality there in what feels like a very different environment.
Well, that's when you also notice on the note of sounds that sound alike. The example I can think of is in Far Cry games. I think the sound of the wind rushing through long grass is very similar to the sound of a rattlesnake's tail. So every time you hear that, there's that moment of before you realize, okay, no, it's just this. And the other thing I was going to add on Subnautica is you also have that one overwhelming consideration as well, where everything you see around you, every creature is actually evolved to be in water. They're all more capable than you in the environment that you're in. You are the one living being in that ocean that isn't supposed to be there. So you are, by your very nature, an interloper into this world. You don't have a place. Everything else is predator, prey, whatever it might be. And you have to actually find out, where are you in regards to the creatures around you? And there are some to which you will very much be predator, and there is some to which you will very much be prey. You just don't know where you stand yet.
I think Subnautica's environment also has one unique feature that you won't see in the forest example that we gave, which is we have kind of an idea of the largest animal on the surface. And the environment of the surface is actually smaller than the environment of the ocean in our familiar territory. So the idea that the forest has this visible limit, the ocean has that visible limit, but the amount of ocean beyond that visible limit is so much larger than what you would have expected with the forest. Because it's not too much above me. There's typically something on the ground further away. In the ocean, it's all around you, and there's so much more.
There's a thing as well where in the ocean and on land, a big difference for me is on land, imagine there's a big monster within this 1 mile range of where you are. You will know. There will be a legacy of it moving. Trees will be knocked down. Trees will be eaten. Possibly, who knows? There'll be creatures that have been torn apart. In the ocean, that sort of washes away. Drops down, some of it gets spread around. So you can have these enormous creatures there. And they might not be really leaving a trace. Whereas you'd expect on land that, okay, by now if there's a giant snake, it must have shed its skin somewhere. Whereas the ocean games, I feel they have much more of that infinite space aspect that lets you never quite know what possibly could be out there. So even when you've seen the biggest creature the game has to offer, you might still be thinking, well, there's more ocean.
I also think there's that element of that environment where carnage in the ocean doesn't last. Yeah. So on land, if there's, a conflict or if there's, prey being eaten, there's going to be blood splatter. that's not going to get cleaned up. So you're going to know that not only is there something here, but it's a predator. It has the capacity for doing tremendous damage. In the ocean, that disappears. Any part that's not eaten will likely sink. Any blood will dissolve, more or less. It will dissipate to the point where it's not detectable. It's way more terrifying. There's no evidence of anything.
That, and if something is attacked, it's not just one thing that's attacking it, and everything's going to pounce on it. So you don't even know what caused that damage. Maybe it was a bunch of little fish that caused it. Piranhas or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you're thinking like, oh, the danger's already gone. No, the danger's there, still eating. I think we kind of covered quite a bit.
Yeah, I think we've all developed a few new phobias as a result of this episode.
The ocean.
Old phobias, new phobias, enhanced phobias, snails. Yeah, who knew? Yeah, who knew?
Podcasts.
So if you are also afraid of snails, tell us in the comments. And
We found the poll.
Yeah. Join the Discord. There are no snails.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, snail-free zone.
Yes.
Very safe. But like the video if you like it. Give it a comment. Subscribe. But really important, hit that alert. But like I mentioned before, comments really, really help push the algorithm. Give us a comment saying this is the worst video I've ever seen in my life. That's fine. The channel could use it. Yeah. Honesty is the best policy. But yeah, and we have a Discord. You can check the description for that. And we will see you guys later for the next episode. And we will check you guys later. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.